Recording?
Transcends
We
in.
are now recording. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Miriam Kent. I'm a lecturer in film and media at Leeds, and I'm joined by my collaborator, Eirini Boukla, who's a lecturer in art and design, and writer and comics practitioner, Rick Worth, who co-convene the series of events. Just to kind of briefly introduce our speakers, we've got Neil Cohn and Nick Sousanis. We are very honored to have them with us. Neil is a cognitive scientist and comics theorist, an associate professor at the Center for Cognition and Communication at Tilburg University. His work focuses on the cognitive processes that influence the interpretation of sequential art forms, to better understand how readers make sense of visual materials. And he currently leads a research center on kind of linguistic and cognitive research, which is called the Visual Language Lab Research Group. Nick Sousanis is an Eisner Award-winning comics author and an associate professor of humanities and liberal studies at San Francisco State University, where he started and runs a comic studies program. Unflattening is by now a kind of staple text in comic studies, in which he presents his innovative research in the form of a comic book, which is amazing. And Nick, you continue to publish on comics, I believe, as a kind of teaching and communicative tool. Yeah, slow. Research is slow, right? So this event is going to take the form of a kind of dynamic conversation that explores comics and cognition from various perspectives. We anticipate that it should last around an hour, but historically we have overrun by several minutes. So if you need to dip out, that's also fine. No one's going to be offended. And we are recording now, and we will circulate that recording to everyone who signed up on the event. Just a note that we do request that cameras remain off. The chat will also be disabled throughout the talking bit, but please save your questions because we'll open the chat towards the end, and also the Q&A function. But yeah, we have also enabled live transcription, so please make use of that. So please welcome Neil and Nick. I believe you're each going to kind of give a short overview of what it is that you do, and then I'll kind of pass over to Eirini to kick us off with some initial questions. And I will stop sharing my slide.
Go Neil.
Great. I think I've been designated to go first, so I'll jump in. First of all, let me thank the organizers for having us. This is a really neat, unique sort of venue. It makes me happy to be able to chat here, I guess, in front of lots of people with Nick. And I'm flattered that so many people decided to join us today. I assume you're all here for him, but thank you for joining as well. And I'm going to jump in and just give a brief little overview primer of what I do and what led me to be here. Can you see my screen? I guess, Nick, you're the only one who can tell me. Okay, thank you. So like many people, I began as someone who drew comics. And by the time I was 10 years old, I even had my own comic company called Fred Company. And I sold comics via mail order catalog to family and friends. And by my time as a teenager, I was working for Image Comics, specifically for Todd McFarlane. This is a picture of me here in this pink box from the back of a Spawn comic after having worked at Comic-Con for Todd McFarlane. And I basically worked for Image Comics and Todd McFarlane throughout my entire teenage years. And during those years as well, I was drawing comics, and I had a multi-issue series, which I guess you would call an outlaw comic at this time, which was 25 pages each. I drew 7 full pages on full Bristol board, so that's several hundred pages right there, and did thumbnails for 30 issues. So, substantial amount of comic creation. And by the time I was in college, I was doing very kind of artsy fartsy comics, as I like to call them, vignettes and poems and things like that. And after college, I even drew a graphic novel, a nonfiction graphic novel about US politics and the pervasive influence of megacorporations on democracy, which is still relevant today, unfortunately. Um, but at that same time, during college, I started making connections with what I knew or understood was happening in comics and what was going on in what I was starting to read about in linguistics and the study of language. And I decided to simply follow this up and kind of change course from my intended career path, which was just to be a comic author, and instead to do research on comics. And so the primary questions that I ask are largely summarized at this point, each by a monograph. So this is the part where I'm going to do some book advertising. My parents were used to be book publishers, so I'm sure they would be proud. Um, the first set of questions I would ask are things like, how are comics structured? What are the cognitive building blocks that are going on in how we organize our mental knowledge for creating and understanding comics? And in this, I would say there's a separation between what I would call comics and visual language. And that is, to some people, that might be the separation of comics and comics medium. That is, visual language is the mental representations, the cognitive constructs that we use to create pictures and draw things, particularly draw things in sequences. And by visual language, it's like saying spoken language. There's lots of visual languages of the world, and everybody's is a little bit different, but there might be people who share a common visual languages. And in my initial works, I was very concerned with theorizing the vocabulary and grammar of visual languages. And this is work that we continue today with theoretical work. Um, in addition to that, I've also asked, how are comics comprehended? By which I mean, what are the cognitive processes that actually we bring to bear in understanding a comic? And to this extent, I've done quite a lot of psychological research, both behavioral, with things like reaction times and eye tracking and things like that. And my primary tool that I've been trained in is actually the measuring of the brain response directly with brainwaves or EEG. And we've done quite a number of these studies as well. And in my previous book, Who Understands Comics, I summarize a lot of this work about the actual study of cognition of comics, and also talk about how comprehension might vary between people of different cultures, across development of child development, across different neurodiversities, and different media, like the comparison between comics and film, and what sort of cognitive constructs those require. In addition to that, I've also asked what actually are the structures in comics, because a lot of people kind of vaguely refer to what is happening in different types of comics, and or have universalist theories that, well, all comics are the same. There's a universalist comics medium that is invariant across cultures. Other people say that, well, there's certain types of cross-cultural variability. And so I decided, well, why don't we look? So we've been doing large-scale data gathering, and my most recent book, The Patterns of Comics, summarizes a corpus of 360 comics from Asia, Europe, and North America, spanning across 9 countries, roughly analyzing 48,000 panels, plus all of Calvin and Hobbes. Um, and this is a data-driven explanation of what's going on. And we're following this directly with what's called the Tintin project, where we actually built software to better be able to analyze the structures that are going on in comics. And with this, we've built a actual global corpus called the Tintin corpus, which spans 1,030 comics from 144 countries and territories, roughly 79,000 panels, of which we have quite a number of dimensions that we've been studying. And all of this data, including the data that was already in my last book, is all going to be publicly available for people to then analyze if they want to. The ones from Patterns of Comics are already available, actually. This one will be once the project wraps. And finally, I'll mention that as Nick is also a comic creator, I've returned to doing comic creation, which is these are roughs, actually rough pages from an upcoming graphic novel of mine, which is about my research, which is going to be coming out probably early 2026 or late 2025, called Speaking in Pictures. And it will be summarizing all this work on visual language. So that's the very rapid primer of my life. So with that, I hand it over to Nick to talk about his life.
Thanks, Neil. That's great. Hold on, let me get the share screen button working. All right. You seeing it, Neil?
Yes.
Should I go to full screen or is this good enough? Is that working well on yours?
I see it just fine. You're welcome. I mean, full screen is either way, but yeah, I see it just
I think
fine.
it's fine. I think it's but not going to get any bigger. Um, Great. Well, first, Eirini, Miriam, and Rick, thank you so much for hosting us and making this conversation happen. Neil, I followed your work a long time, and somehow we've seemed to almost run into each other a whole bunch of times. So I'm glad we could do this 5,000 miles apart or wherever we're at right now. So thank you all for coming, and I'm gonna fly through a lot of pictures and say some words about it as long as my voice holds out. Um, so my work on flattening, my dissertation in comics, the main point in going down this path was to make access to big ideas, and to push against what education looked like, and to say, well, hey, maybe there's something beyond 12-point text, double spaced, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so, it was trying to use comics to show what other ways education could be, and to challenge it, and to use that amphibious language to do something different. And so, if I started with access, I think what I really found in doing this is that it changed how I thought. It didn't just become about making ideas accessible through images, but it became a changed way of thinking for me. I think that's clearly true for me, but now I happen to run a comics program, and it's become, I see this in my students, regardless of their skill. So I take students and we play a lot. We play a lot and we try a lot of things. And regardless of who they are, they seem to come out of it thinking in comics in ways they didn't expect. And some of them are super skilled. The student made a comic about my program. Um, Super skilled. They make comics playing with the form, showing off all the different ways they can draw. And some of them, and this I see a question on us coming later, aren't so skilled. Can't draw noses. Definitely couldn't have drawn a bicycle, but they can think about how to use these blank panels. This is a comic about a kid's a grandmother who had Alzheimer's. I didn't know my grandma. I was told about her. This person no longer existed, and then she was nobody. Like, he understood how to use the comic's form. And this one I always show this very shy student, not much of a drawer, but using the form, using panels, panel breaking, and then ultimately moving us in directions through the way she used words on a page. So it's not even about drawing. So I've always been moved by Seth's suggestion that comics are poetry and graphic design, and try to make that sort of an integral part of how I start classes. And I always start, and if we'd had a little more time, we were going to do this together with my activity Grids and Gestures, which is on my site for people who want to try it. But it's really starting to think about how a page works, how much comics are maybe kind of like storyboards, but really we care about not just what goes on in the panel, but the size of the panel, the shape of the panel, the orientation, and where it is spatially oriented on the page. To produce, so that in the activity they produce comics that think about time, and they think about space, and they think about the nonlinear connections on the page as well as the sequential connections, and understand how much they understand about drawing. So I think one of my key things in how I think about comics is how the static and flat nature of them is really a superpower. It's really the ability to make connections both in linear and nonlinear fashions, and care about drawing and meta drawing at the same time is a big deal. And promotes, I'm going to skip a couple things here, and comes into some pretty exciting territory. So that ability to be sequential and simultaneous, it's not just about adding pictures, not just about bringing pictures into the conversation, but it's about changing what reading looks altogether. Um, and it allows some pretty interesting possibilities, which I'm going to just fly through because from things here where you see the pyramid emerge, if you see the hole, Gasoline Alley, where you see the guy bumbling from the left on a simultaneous scene, and the weird things you can do with panel breaking. So again, for me, it was a different way of thinking and a different way of asking questions. And I came, and so I'm glad to see Neil show. I didn't know that about your early time. That's pretty amazing. I was a comics maker as a kid, and then a lapsed comics maker. I studied mathematics in university, and in my return to it, my first return to it was very, and it's very influenced by McCloud, and very McCloud-like looking comic, me with my T-shirt and everything. And 2 weeks later, I made a follow-up comic, and I wanted to, I was like, Scott has done that so well. I wanted to do something else, and so I was quite moved by Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie's "This Is Information," which is all this metaphorical resonance, and that really it hit me. I sort of smashed my visual narrator there, my avatar, and switched from that point forward to really working with visual metaphor. Um, so again, I'm flying through the pictures. You don't need to slow down on. But that became formal decision number one, was to shift to non-illustration and visual verbal metaphor. And then formal decision two, and that's what I'll deal with the rest of this, is how much I could embody the idea in the shape of the page and really think about the way the reader moves. And that's gone to extreme lengths with this comic on entropy, which is about how things go against the downhill flow of entropy. So it sort of moves normally, moves kind of normally, and then it asks you to go at some point right to left and bottom to top before returning. I spend a lot of time thinking about how the reader's eye moves, and not in the studied way that Neil does, but in the how it feels as the maker. And I've come to think about this a lot as choreography, a very slow moving choreography, but thinking about how do I organize these elements? How do I play with choreography, which is something we're involved with, before we're born. We're in the rhythms of our mother's heartbeat. So how do I move you? How do I get that page to feel a certain way? How do I get you to snake across the page? And that's even become an activity for my students, something I've called zithers, where we draw paths and they have to follow it. So I think comics are this profoundly powerful way to present our thinking, and also a powerful way to generate it. And this has been a hard lesson for me to learn. Is I think we discover so much through our movement, through our bodies. I like Linda Berry's quote: "In motion, you speak the language that language is based on." And I don't think, we don't sit around and ideas bubble out of our heads like Athena, but instead we make a mess, and I make a lot of messes. And I learn from my sketches, and I learn in conversation from my sketches. And I really learn a lot from how badly I draw my sketches, because I discover new things in them all the time that I don't expect. And I'm going to close with some teasers for the new work, which is very, very slowly coming. But this is a 15-foot opening chapter. It's a continuous sequence, and it's got elements that move forwards and backwards in time. And I'm trying to keep track of them all with different colors and different things. But it's the sketches that really help me understand where it is I'm trying to go. This is a little tease of what it actually looks like. And I think part of that is playing with constraints, playing with rules, with boxes you draw around yourself to say, all right, well, how can this can free me to discover new things? And so in the new work, there's been constraints about no panel borders, circles, unusual ways of moving. And again, there's a whole chapter on circles, to talk about how we start, and seeing where that again leads me to new ways to present information, new ways to understand my thinking. And where I'm in the midst of right now is trying to talk about origin of the universe, a sort of light topic, and giving myself this constraint of circles and hexagons, which I do not recommend hexagons. So with that, I'll say thank you, and look forward to the questions.
Okay,
Or we'll just talk about
thank you
bicycles.
both.
Or bicycles, yeah.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you both for the presentations. I mean, a lot of things to process there. I will start with the first question that we kind of thought about asking you, and it's kind of generic but specific as well. Why should we draw? I'm saying in bracket comics, even if we believe we can't draw.
Do you want me to start on that one?
I can
Oh.
start if you.
Why don't
I
you
don't know
start?
who.
I'll
All
let
right, I'll start.
start last. So why don't you pick up where you?
Yeah. I mean, I think, and that's, I'd seen this question, which I usually include those student works anyway, but I really wanted to highlight them. I think my experience with it, well, I'll tell you, the reason that that grids exercise has worked so well for me is that it moves them beyond thinking, well, all right, I'm going to do 6 panels as a stick figure, and also, and instead starting to think about, well, how does the space of the page work? How can I organize my ideas, and how can I make connections that I maybe can't make when I'm writing, or so that how can I make some of the ways that my brain actually works? And I find that they get quite liberated from that and really start to understand the very quick slides I showed of the student who the end page moved around. She later wrote she wrote, I asked her some questions about it for something I wrote. And it really helped her understand herself in ways that she couldn't. And I think the comics language, no, well, I just stepped into a minefield there, Neil. That
Okay.
was, uh, but I think the comics form allows us to get at our own thinking in ways we don't expect. And I think if you can get past the fact that, well, hey, maybe you're not somebody who draws noses so nicely, or bicycles for that matter. But there's still ways to use the shape of the page and the space of the page and how you make marks on it to ask questions and to make meaning. And I'm just always blown away, particularly by what some of my non-drawers who dive in and just start exploring how they can do this. And it's just really exciting. And I could talk for an hour and show slides for a couple hours about that. But I'll hand it over to Neil.
Sure. So I also have taught a how to create, well, there's a class called Visual Thinking and Composition, which was really a how to create comics class. And I taught that for many years and actually just taught it for the last time last year. And I, like Nick, often feel, even the people who are, don't consider themselves that proficient at drawing are, um, often create really wonderful things. And it's often really great to see that. But I think as the cognitive scientist side, I might step back to an even bigger level in answering that, which is, and I didn't mean to immediately invoke an advertisement for another book, but I will, which is that I have another book coming out in May at this point, which is not really about comics. It's really about a kind of about language and the nature of what language is in the first place, where we essentially argue that we have misdiagnosed what our communicative capacity is in the first place, particularly language, and in thinking that primarily there's this belief that like language is the primary thing, and our other aspects of communicating, particularly our moving our bodies, like you'll see me gesticulate wildly all the time, which is fundamental to our communicative system, and drawing are all the belief is that language is core and those are periphery. And so thus it seems like we have to make this big argumentation for why it's so good for people to draw. If that's this, why should we use this tertiary thing in addition to language? And what we arrive at through looking at like a very big literature as well as very minutia of actual phenomena that occur throughout the world, is that this entire perspective is wrong to begin with. And in fact, the capacity for producing pictures or drawing, and the capacity for speaking and the capacity for gesticulating aren't separate behaviors, in fact. So even though we experience them out in the world as if they are separately, like pictures are over here and words are over here, as people often talk about, what we argue is that they all stem from actually an integrated cognitive system, where it's actually the building blocks of all of those behaviors are all shared. And those behaviors are different sub-selections of sharing different building blocks. You can think about it like, you have a bunch of ingredients, and if you mix certain ingredients together, you get one type of behavior, and you mix other ingredients, you get another type of behavior, but the ingredients are all the same. And in fact, it's all one mini kitchen, I guess, in this metaphor. So um, if you take that perspective, then the answer of why should people draw is because our communicative capacity is multimodal by default. It's not because it's this tertiary thing. It's fundamental to being human to begin with and to the way that we communicate to begin with. So taking this perspective really forces you to reconsider all of the assumptions that you have about basic um, assumptions about communication in the first place. Another one that I like to throw out is that if you believe that our communicative capacity is inherently multimodal to begin with, something like comics is actually more of the default to what human cognition would prefer than bare text, because bare text is actually an impoverished form. So when people often say, well, I don't like comics because, when I read a book, I like to imagine what's happening or something like that. Now I can't imagine. I mean, that's fine if that's their preference. But one of my thoughts is, well, maybe the reason that you're having to do this imagining is because your brain would like it to be a multimodal signal, but it's actually getting an impoverished signal. So now you have to overcompensate with mental imagery. That's the flipped perspective from the multimodal view. So I would say the reason people should draw is because it's human nature to draw. It's part of who we are, and it allows you to more embrace your innate wider capacity for meaning making, even if you haven't gone through the development to build a rich visual vocabulary to know to do that. It's still part of our capacity for meaning making more broadly.
Yeah. Can I jump back onto that?
Yeah.
Neil, that's a wonderful answer. I mean, so much of the current work I'm doing is really sparked by teaching this stuff. I mean, it's sort of in Unflattening, I sort of talk about where some of this comes from, but mostly I talk about it in retrospect to the book. It's not like it actually in there. And both, as you now know as well, having small children watching, I pulled, when I tried to get down to 80 slides last night, I pulled out, I have this wonderful picture of my boy at about a year old, weaving through the chair legs and table legs, and like how much you know through your body, right? Like he's not calculating the distances, right? But he knows because he understands his body. And we put people in desks and we say this is what learning looks like, but we learn all this stuff long before we have language. So I'm excited for your work, and I have so many other things to say to that, but I know we have more to do. So sorry, Eirini.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's fascinating what you both kind of like explaining, and it's very relevant to all of us because sometimes we have come across those students that they resist and they say, oh, we can't draw, we don't want to draw, or we don't feel like drawing, etc., etc. So from this, the next question, I guess, is how can drawing narratives, again, in brackets as in comics, contribute to cognitive processes such as attention, memory, and comprehension compared to traditional text-based mediums?
So I'll jump to start with that, which is, I don't know how I would say how can they contribute, but I mean you use all of those things when you read a comic. So all of those cognitive processes are involved. Um, uh, of course, when you read a comic, you also have to know the rules and principles of comics. So um, uh, you don't get it for free. You have to know how to do it in the first place and have a proficiency in it. So I would say what we don't know, there's a lot of experiential things that people talk about in terms of what comic reading has given them. There is actually a huge lack of research on what does comic reading do for basic cognitive abilities. So there's not been studies that say, well, people read comics and thus they have better visual perception, or they have more focal attention, or things like that. There's really not much out there about that, unfortunately. I wish there was more. I proposed a grant that didn't get funded to look at that at one point. But again, all those things are involved already within comics comprehension, and so in having to engage those things, you're going to have to engage these cognitive processes that are at least somewhat different than text because of the nature of the affordances of pictures. Nick very nicely showed in his work that this kind of tension that he exploits between the sequential and the tabular, so to speak, or the whole, in addition to the parts. And that sort of attention is not something that you have with, say, pure text, unless you push it to, right? So text certainly could have more unconstrained sequencing in its visual form because it is a conversion of sound into graphics. As I call it in my upcoming book, writing is drawing sound. It's the way that we draw sound, but it's a cognitive hack. It doesn't come for free. You take most of education to learn how to do it, as opposed to pictures, which are the natural way of expressing ourselves through graphic forms. Um, but Nick showed a very lovely example from one of his students where it is largely text that isn't just this a z path left to right, back and forth and down, and that was purely text, and that also then forces you to engage with it in a different way. So text alone can have that too, but it largely isn't, just by virtue of convention. And I feel like we allow for an unconstrained aspect of that more with pictures, because the default is to think about pictures as being poetry rather than to think about it in a normative way, is I think the way that I would think about it. And I'll let Nick take over from there.
Yeah, that's great. Give me a couple other thoughts and the one response to the actual question. I mean, it's one of the questions I just asked my class the other day. How do you, do people read the words first in the comic? Do they read the images first? Do they go back and forth? How are all the different, do you gauge the shape of the page and say, all right, well, I really want to, that's just not a question you ask with a word book, right? A word book's, and I was like, did all my students read word books? And they all have read word books. You carriage return, right? You have to do that. So I think that's part of it. And just as an aside, for years, people have been recommending me to read uh, the story of your life by Ted Chiang, which was the basis for the movie The Arrival, which I haven't seen, but I finally read it and I totally understood it. It goes a little bit back to the last question. Neil, have you read it?
I have not, actually. It's another one that
No.
people.
Well, spoiler alert:
Yeah.
the aliens basically speak in comics that are non-sequential, but I really understood it. So anybody who's interested in that, it was anyway related to this, but I do an activity related to this grids and gestures, and that we have them make a line. Like, what does a happy line look like? And they'll make this curving thing, and it's pretty predictable what people are going to make. And then they'll make an angry line, and all of the students noticed it this time. It was loud in the room when they made an angry line, right? Like, it's like you can probably hear it in their jaw, right? Making an angry line, and you can hear it across the room. Like, all of a sudden the pencil's dug in. Um, and I think there's something really significant about how that action is taking place. And I recall one of the early times I did my activity with some group, and the secretary hosting the thing, she participated in it, and I listened to her and watched her, and she ripped through the paper while she was making this scribble, and she ended up emailing me afterwards to explain what her because this is something where I ask them to organize the shape of their day, so they just have to talk about the events of their day without words, and with the potential for sequence and non-sequence and mark making that the activity allows. And she went into I didn't ask, right? I didn't ask like what's going on. And she told me this whole thing about this fight with her boyfriend, and how and I find when I do this activity, or a lot of comics making activities, things pour out of people that they don't know is the girl's comic that read in this way at the end. It became a whole journey of like self-discovery about her life that she didn't anticipate. And she didn't get there because of her skills. She got there because she had these tools, I think, as Neil put so well, these tools that really allowed her to use her whole self um, in ways that she couldn't. And I think about that for myself too. I mean, I think about like I was a comics maker as a kid, and I stopped I never totally stopped, but I stopped doing it in part because I had that perception that comics were this, for entertainment and things like that. But it took longer to realize that no, this is how I think most comfortably, and what can I do with that, or maybe not most comfortably, but this is how I can do things that I can't do without it. Basta.
I'm aware a little bit of the time, so I might skip a couple of questions, and I'm going to
Yeah.
go to considering the wide range of artistic skills and narrative styles that comics can accommodate, what are the potential benefits and challenges of utilizing comics as a medium for communication and expression in academia?
I'll start this one.
Yeah.
I mean, this kind of comes back to what we've been going on here, but I think really understanding what you can do with comics is the key. I think if you try to draw comics like someone does and your skills aren't part of that, then you know you're always going to be falling short of it. If you're like, I want to draw luscious noses and I don't study that, I don't know what a luscious nose is. Anyway, that's, but if you can learn, I mean, because comics, like that girl's thing, which has no pictures at the end, right? And we do an activity in class where we do pictureless comics. So they just think about letter forms and panel shape, and it's exciting. It's exciting to see what they come up with, and then and in fact, I had a student do her final project. She was nervous about drawing. She was a great student, but she did an entire piece that dealt with domestic abuse in her life, completely pictureless, all using words, and it stopped my class cold. It's like 20 pages of this thing, and it was stunning. So I think if people find their ways, and I think I'm going to keep giving student stories. I think if they find their ways to use the form, which are so varied, and that's the beauty of teaching a class where you've got people who say they don't draw and really skilled ones, because they're all mixing and learning from each other. Because the skilled ones, and I consider myself in this category, are often can get stuck because you're so used to, in my case, drawing like 70s and 80s superhero comics, right? Like it's hard for me to that I default back to that, right? It's hard to like stretch and be something different. But being in a class where these people who are discovering this stuff like fresh, and it's really exciting. And so I'll end my answer with the one student. Well, maybe I won't end the answer, but um, who's in a bunch of my classes, and he just didn't. He worked hard, but he just didn't do anything that was interesting, and just kept not doing it. And then we do an activity with Matt Madden's 99 Ways to Tell a Story, where you add a page to it. And he did this thing where he's like, well, what if Matt Madden was a Christmas tree? So everything's the same except Matt Madden is a Christmas tree. And he did it. He found the right pen for him. And he found the right sort of cleanness of mark that he could do. And it was very simple. And it was great. And then he went on from that point forward. He could express himself in a way that was really sharp, and he really got it out. And he'd been stumbling, but he finally found the thing that was his, that worked with how his body works, how his thinking worked. And I think that, so for academics in this, I think if we really get immersed in how to think about the form, there's a lot you can learn to say. And I think that moves away from being I'm not saying you can be willy-nilly. I'm saying quite the opposite. But I'm saying comics can look so many different ways, and it's really the exciting part about them that I have a lot more. But Neil, go for it.
Sure. So I'll just say two things. I'll try to keep it brief so we can keep moving forward. Which is, if the context is how can we use comics in communicative purposes and say educational purposes? There's 2 points that I want to point out. The first is that when we talk about comics and education, it's actually two different things that get talked about at the same time that are perhaps conflated, and they correspond to what I would call comics versus visual language. So one is comics in education is things like using mouse in history classes, or using, works of established published comics in literature classes, things like that. The other one is using visual language, i.e., the creation of pictures and possibly visual language plus text, which would be creating what comics, which is largely what Nick talked about. Those are separate things. So the use of the creation of visual language, multimodal communication is one thing, and the use of, say, established comics that are comics are two separate things in educational and communicative contexts. And I think both of them are fully valid, but it's worth recognizing that those are not the same advocacy. The second thing I'll add about that is that in order to get the most benefit out of these in context, it's worth also remembering that proficiency is required. So in creation, we just already talked about what to do if you don't have that proficiency, and is it still worth it? And yes, of course, it is still worth to do. But on, say, the communicative side, on the receiving side, people get the most benefit out of comics and communicative contexts and educational contexts when they are already proficient in them. So people who are not proficient in understanding comics, don't have experience with comics already, actually don't get a benefit from them as much educationally, or actually sometimes do worse. So that's not to say you shouldn't use them, but you have to be mindful that there is a proficiency and a fluency that is involved, that is required. And so if you want to be getting that benefit from people who maybe don't have that proficiency, you need to teach them that proficiency in order for them to then get what ends up being a benefit in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say absolutely. I mean, I don't know that we're saying different things, so I don't. But I think proficiency. I mean, that makes sense. But proficiency just takes so many different shapes, right? Like if we taught comics in the '80s, we'd all be doing how to draw comics the Marvel way, right?
Yeah,
And
and I think
I,
that's key also, and that's part of one of my big emphases is that I don't think there is a thing called the comics medium. Um, I think that is a cover term that is a
yeah,
convenient universal cover term, because really what we see is that there's systematic variation across comics around the world, and across time. And it's really not even that it's cross-cultural variation. It's particular what I would call visual languages. So the systematic patterns that are used to create manga or Japanese visual language are systematically different than what I would call as the Kirbian visual language that's used in superhero comics. Um, and those are used in variant of culture. So manga look pretty consistent whether they come from Africa or Japan
yeah,
or the Middle East. The patterns that they use are fairly consistent. Um, so that is a visual language that has its own properties, and you have for people who are then proficient in those properties, both in production and then also comprehension. So if you read a comic that is not your preferred type of visual language, it's probably going to feel a little bit off, and that might be mistaken for something like being bad, quote unquote. Um, but it's really a proficiency difference. And I'll an example of my own. I have started reading manga very young when they first were being imported into the US. I felt very proficient at them very quickly. When I started shortly around the same time reading French comics, I really disliked them because I thought they just didn't flow well. And really, when I look back on it, it's not that there was anything wrong with the French comics. It's that my proficiency, I had a different fluency than what was being produced there. And I think that people often mistake their own proficiency for something being about the nature of the quality of the comics, which is usually not the case.
yeah. I'm going to add
This,
a tiny.
yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, you can.
Go ahead.
I was going to take it in a slightly just this is not a plug exactly, but we've started a certificate in nonfiction comics making with students
Oh, fun.
who come. You know, they've had the classes before, so they almost all of them have a high level of proficiency. Um, uh, but what's exciting is that they're now going to team up with people in our university and create comics about them, and they have different skills, very different ways. So finding matches that work with their skills. You know, somebody who's this really gorgeous illustrator likes to draw organic forms, like they work well with this person, and so finding those things. I don't know. I mean, we're in the midst of our first year of it right now, so I have more to say to this answer in the coming year.
I've never heard of a certificate in nonfiction comic creation. Am I assuming that this is the first of that of its kind?
I have no idea. I'll say it just became both because of my own work, obviously, and so much like the world of comics. How many of my students are getting a job drawing at Marvel? Like none. I mean, maybe not none, but probably none. But how many of them are going to have skills about how to make meaning on the comics page and be able to fall into whatever their profession is or their community, their biking community, right? And be able to make a comic about it that impacts a lot of people. And I look at my own publications. I've been published by some pretty interesting places, none of whom publish comics. otherwise, right? They don't do that. And so to me, I think for academics, I think to your proficiency and to mine, like finding your way, um, I think it's a really exciting terrain. And I think the key is to get academics or the people they work with to really understand what they can do with the form or the forms or the whatever we want to call it, right? Find a way that does it and roll with it and understand the comics as well as they understand their subject matter. Because if there's a big mismatch there, that's where things go slightly awry. All right, I'll be quiet.
Well, I mean, we've got all sorts of things to ask, but we have to keep an eye on time. And I think we all also want to open. I think I had a message from Miriam to open to the audience.
We could all listen to you, Nick and Neil talking kind of all day by yourself, doing all the work yourself, but,
it was lovely.
we do have
wonderful.
We have a couple of questions already, but if anyone else from the audience would like to ask anything else, I am also very much aware of time. I don't want to keep our speakers longer than they have been scheduled to. But we have a question from Francis, whose question kind of ties into some of what you were saying, Neil, about like different cultural contexts, and you mentioned manga as well. Francis says that their work relates to UK-China collaboration and intercultural communication. Do you have any comments, either of you, relating to UK-China differences in visual language and how comics or drawing can help to aid discussion of cultural differences? Which is a really great question.
It's a good question. At least from the comics that we've analyzed, Chinese comics end up looking more structurally similar to manga, even though they might not on the surface look like manga all the time. Although there's a few different threads. So some look more like French bande dessinée than they do like manga, but it depends on what traditions those people fall in. And I would say that there's not necessarily, as far as I can tell, a uniform Chinese visual language, but there's multiple visual languages globally that are interacting, that China is engaging with, like many places, I should say. So it's perhaps useful to think about, again, in my terms, visual languages are not tied to countries per se, because languages themselves are not tied to countries, even though they might have a prototypical origin in one country or another. They're not ultimately, nationalistic. They're linguistic forms, so they permeate across countries. So, at least how to aid cross-cultural differences. I think some of the things that Nick was alluding to is probably pretty effective in exercises where, like you said, in a team building context, if people draw together, you can converge on a common vocabulary or a creole, as it were, a pigeon rather, a visual pigeon that people can then share amongst them, that group that is a mixture of the different fluencies that they come to the table with, and that potentially could be beneficial for that particular community, as a way to come together. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me, at least.
Yeah, I like that answer, Neil. I say, I think drawing together only, making things together only helps a lot. I don't have much experience, if any, with Chinese comics, so I don't, I'd like to see them, but I haven't. So, I'd say go for it. The more you play with, just playing period, but comics are a nice forum that you can play with and people can bring all kinds of skills to the table.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really great answers. We do have another question. We have a question from Esther.
Hey, Esther.
Who says, yes, why do you think marketing / advertising understands that comics and visual thinking is a natural way of human communication, but it is so difficult to make the same understood in educational contexts? Also a great question.
Very good question.
Yeah. Do you want to respond? Because
why don't you start? I led last time. Why don't you lead?
All right. I saw an upcoming one that I'm going to respond to. I'm not. So I wish. Can we hear Esther or no? Because I kind of want clarification here. Are you saying and maybe Neil, you can help me out here, that educational places are still against allowing comics.
I think
Is
that's the
that
implication, is that at least there's a thrust to push for education where advertisers just simply know that this is useful, is what it
yeah, I
sounds
mean,
like the question is.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think about when I started doing my dissertation, and I was pretty naive about it. I just thought, of course, I can do it in comics. We've seen Mouse, we've seen Understanding Comics. So this argument is over. And while I didn't have a hard time with it, I definitely realized that my work had to be an argument for it. But we see more of these. I see that Kay Sohini is on the somewhere in this thing, and she's did a couple 2 years ago now. I think Kay defended her dissertation in comics. So I mean, I think it's definitely, and I've been on committees besides Kay, many others. So I feel like education is opening to it a lot more than it was. I, I mean, I think you still got to make it. You have librarians who are incredibly supportive and make comics possible, and then you still have people who say, "Well, when are you going to do real reading?" Right? That real reading question still exists and still permeates. But it's definitely changed. So I guess I wish we could hear from you, Esther, because I kind of want to know more what you mean. But maybe Neil has a take that'll.
I mean, advertisers do whatever they think is going to convince people of things. And to some degrees, part of the problems might be simply the label comics has a bad
Yeah.
rap historically. And advertisers don't need to rest on that because they say, well, these are advertisements. Even if they look exactly the same, they aren't called comics because they're just advertisements. So this is why one of the reasons I say that comics is not comics is a social term rather than a structural term. And that visual language is really what we're talking about. And then visual languages are used all over the place because languages are used all over the place. So I think, advertisers are just going to do whatever they think is going to best make them money. And they'll use what's most effective. And in a lot of, there's a very large academic study of advertising within communication sciences and elsewhere. Much larger than comics, I would say, even corresponding to that recognition. But the building blocks are largely the same. And I'll point out perhaps to some to no surprise to anybody is that there's a lot of places in culture where things begin as drawings but then don't end up as drawings. So blueprints, interior design, fashion, technology, all of these things are drawings first. It's just that we don't see them as drawings afterwards, and so then we forget that they are fundamentally pictorial beforehand, and that is part of the fabric of culture generally. And then we disregard the visual, the capacity for drawing as special or something like that, even though it's the basis of much of culture.
Yeah, that's great. I have a tiny last answer to Esther. I think too, like, I tell people, oh, I did my dissertation in comics form, and their first response is, oh, who are your characters? Who are they fighting? Right? Like, so I think part of it is even if they think it's cool, their perception, and my students too, their perception of comics is still so narrow, right? Like all the people on this thing obviously have a much broader perception of what comics are. So I think, I definitely I've seen it as my mission for a long time to proselytize on this. Like I think you still have to convince people that comics are a broader thing. But I think there are so many more examples to point to now. From what we've been talking about to K to so many projects out there that exist. It's just easier to make your argument than it used to be. I hope we take one of the questions in the chat. Sorry, I saw one that I wanted to.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, we will need to be slightly selective with some of these questions, but since you, Nick, requested to have a go at Kevin's question, so just to summarize Kevin's question, which is about accessibility, what should we consider those with impaired vision with speech bubbles? How might we kind of reconcile that? And also for hearing impaired, would adding audio to characters to speech bubbles and closed captions be redundant, one or the other, is what Kevin has asked.
So can I share screen again?
Sure.
So I skipped over two specific slides, but I've been involved in this project sort of accidentally about making comics accessible for blind readers for the last 3 years. Something I was interested in a little bit while I was making, or aware of when I was making my work. Like, I'm trying to make this work accessible, and like I have super left out this slice of the population by my method, by my particular sort of overuse of the visual as the meaning, and by my metaphor, which is all about visual. So I've been sort of curious about it for a long time and collecting whatever resources exist, which have been kind of limited. And we started hosting events, and I'll put a link in the chat to it when I finish with this. And then last year, happened to make with my colleague, we happened to make a comic for MIT Technology Review that is about how difficult the problem is. And it's intentionally like overly visual comic, but we built an audio track and description thing at the same time as we were making it. And then last night, just yesterday, we had a chat. We've been trying to make a test out an audio description version of unflattening, which is a very difficult challenge. And it speaks to why I recommended the book that The Arrival is based on. This non-linearity of thing is really impossible to translate a sort of spatial juxtapositions into a necessarily linear description. And one of the things I did besides working on different description tracks is I made a tactile map of, because as I was describing this page, which is about the sequential side of comics, I was like, well, I'm telling you guys about everything that's on here, and that's fine, but there's no way you can keep track of where you've moved to. So I tried to put placeholders. These just identify the caption. So when I speak, when I say caption 1, caption 2, whatever, they know where they're at. And the few things that are not on the path are identified there. So it is an incredibly difficult problem. I think one of the biggest things we've discovered, and I'll stop the share here. One of the biggest things we've discovered is there is no one size fits all at all. I mean, there's people who became blind later in life that still want to know, the color of Batman's cape, and they want to know the shape it's making. There's some people that really just want to know what happened, and everything kind of in between. So I think, it came up in our conversation yesterday from one of our panelists that, technology may end up playing a pretty big role in ability to sort of zoom in and zoom out to how much detail you want. And it's one I've become an accidental evangelist for, because I don't, it's kind of shocking to me at this point in time that if you're interested in Spider-Man and you can't see, you're just out of luck. Unless you got somebody who wants to read it to you. There's no universal thing going on about that. So it's a big problem, a big challenge, and I'd like to see more of it. And I'm going to put my resource in the chat. And yeah, I don't know if you got something to that, Neil, but
No, I think that was a great answer. I thought the suggestion within the question itself of should we be using, speech bubbles, et
oh yeah,
cetera, is interesting ideas, and things like that I think are not exploited as much as they possibly could be. And it's certainly an interesting idea that's worth testing.
yeah. Well, that's some of the things. One of the panelists, who's the accessibility officer for Amazon, he's blind since a young child. That there are a lot of these tools out there. There are a lot of these things exist. They're just not being deployed in comics very much. Yeah, so I think the potential is there. It is a challenge. I mean, even with a more straightforward comic, there's still a lot to lose. And how much information can somebody handle hearing that they can take in, seeing in no time? Anyway.
Yeah,
Right.
the one thing I'd add to that is to say that, again, if you think about the system as a whole as being a multimodal system rather than a unimodal system, um, the reason why it's multimodal is because our different modalities have different affordances. That is, they allow for communicating via different ways. And so when you take one away, and then if you say by impairment or disability or something, simply don't have access to that, simply substituting something else is not going to be easy because it doesn't have the same affordances as the thing that you're not getting. And that does make it a very difficult problem. or challenge rather than problem, maybe.
Challenge, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to kind of cut anyone short, but we are approaching. Well, we've gone
Yeah,
past our ending. Do we have time for one more question, or
I'm
not?
here, so might as well.
Nick, do you need to
No,
leave
I'm good. I'm
quickly?
good for a little bit. No problem.
Okay. We have an interesting question from Jessica, who I'm going to kind of summarize this. I'm sorry, Jessica, but just in in the interest of time, Jessica has said that she uses kind of comics making in her kind of anti-oppression workshops. Participants first scribble a stick figure scene about their story of bias or discrimination and show and tell their experience to the folks in the room, and they feel much more seen. And more surprising, people in the room get it, understand the microaggression or discrimination much more quickly than if that had been like a conversation or exchange. Do either of you have any insights on how that can happen?
I'm gonna let you start, Neil, because I missed part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting situation. I mean, I don't know the exact contexts for therapeutic sessions and things like that, but certainly, as Nick was describing before, graphics are an effective way of conveying emotional states, and to some degree, there's a if you're, say, drawing a stick figure and then showing it while describing what the problems are, you are disembodying the issues from yourself and giving it to the stick figure to then have that those issues, and then people maybe are more willing to immediately understand it when it's not directly coming from the person and instead has this additional facet. I'd be curious if the same thing would happen with, say, a puppet or something that then disembodies it from the person who is expressing it. That's the best thing that's my first thought, at least.
Yeah, it seems like a good response. I keep rereading the question. I think it's really, really fascinating. I haven't, I can't really say a lot about. I think your idea about the puppet makes a lot of sense. Like stick figure is a stand-in, and we give it some life. I do think drawing abstractly and mark making too can definitely help that. And like I said, you see people just like dig into the paper. It's always even when they don't realize they're doing it. I'm fascinated by it, but I don't have anything to add there.
I think that's perfectly fine since, yeah, as I said, we've we've overrun. But thank you so much. I think we will draw the session to a close, but everything you've been talking about has been actually really inspirational and informative and interesting. So thank you so much, Neil and Nick.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for all the participants for coming and your amazing questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them, but yeah, this has been amazing. Our next session is on well, one of our co-conveners actually is going to be co-presenting. Rick is going to be chatting to Jordan Culver and Richard Wiseman about their work, Hocus Pocus, which is also
it's a great book.
Brilliant book. But yeah, we will be circulating
your book.
details about that in due course. But thank you all for coming, and yeah, hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
So
Thank
much.
you.